Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of the most intense, complex, and frankly, devastating conflicts of the entire 20th century, the Algerian War of Independence. It's a massive piece of history that literally shaped the modern borders of North Africa, while also completely rewriting the book on military ethics and international law. We're going to objectively unpack the facts, right from the historical sources, to see exactly how this unfolded. Okay, let's start by wrapping our heads around this staggering figure, 1.5 million. That represents the estimated Algerian death toll during this conflict. Because of this absolutely tremendous sacrifice, Algeria is known globally today as the land of 1.5 million martyrs. When you consider the population size back then, that number is just immense. It really underscores the sheer scale of the devastation we're talking about. So, to really grasp this history, here's our roadmap. We'll be covering the Land of Martyrs, the Battle of Algiers, systemic torture and terror, the Evian Accords, and finally, amnesties and confessions. Let's get right into it. Part 1, the Land of Martyrs, focusing on 132 years of colonial rule. You know, the build-up to this conflict wasn't just a few tense years. It spanned over a century. France's invasion of Algeria actually kicked off way back in 1830, causing widespread devastation right from the start. Fast forward over 100 years to 1954, and the National Liberation Front, or FLN, ignites a major armed uprising. By 1957, the conflict reaches a boiling point in major urban areas, with the infamous Battle of Algiers. And finally, by 1962, Algerian independence is officially achieved. But remember, for over a century, the Muslim Algerian population faced segregation and highly unequal rights, which completely set the stage for this irreversible push for freedom. Now, here's a really crucial detail. For decades, the French government absolutely refused to call this a war. In fact, they didn't officially use that term until 1999. Instead, they labeled it a mere operation of public order against terrorism. So why does that matter? Well, by not recognizing the FLN as a legitimate enemy combatant force, the French military effectively sidestepped the 1949 Geneva Conventions. They treated captured fighters simply as criminals, completely bypassing the international rules meant to guarantee the humane treatment of detainees. Moving on to Part 2, the Battle of Algiers and the extreme escalation into asymmetric warfare. By the mid-1950s, things fundamentally shifted into a classic David and Goliath scenario of asymmetric warfare. You've got the FLN relying heavily on urban guerrilla tactics. They're using targeted assassinations and notably having women disguise themselves as Europeans to smuggle bombs in everyday shopping baskets right past military checkpoints. On the flip side, you have the French military, commanded by General Massu, clamping down with industrialized systemic repression. We're talking massive crackdowns, strict curfews, and heavy checkpoints everywhere. It was this almost invisible, civilian integrated insurgency clashing head-on with a conventional, heavily armed paratrooper force. But to really understand the complexity on the ground, we've got to talk about a group called the Harkis. These were Muslim Algerians who actually joined the French army. And their motivations, they were all over the map. Some fought as mercenaries just for the money, some out of deep loyalty to France, and others joined purely in retribution after a loved one was killed by the FLN. As we'll see, their alliance with the French would eventually lead to absolutely devastating consequences for them. Which brings us to Part 3, systemic torture and terror and the ultimate ethical breakdown. This is where things get really grim. During the conflict, everyday items were literally repurposed into instruments of state-sanctioned pain. Take the djezhin, for example. Originally, this was just a standard electricity generator meant to power field telephones. But French forces repurposed it into a notorious and incredibly widespread torture device. It was applied indiscriminately to suspects and everyday civilians alike to extract information and essentially just spread terror. I want to pause for a second because we really need to comprehend the sheer gravity of these methods. Bigert's shrimps was the horrific, grim moniker given to victims who were literally thrown out of helicopters into the sea with concrete poured onto their feet by French paratroopers. These tactics completely threw the judicial process out the window. It led to countless disappearances where people just vanished without a trace, leaving their families completely in the dark and generating immense psychological terror across the entire population. So, with all this happening, how did the world find out? Well, despite massive and aggressive government censorship, the truth started leaking out. In 1958, a newspaper director named Henri Alleg, who was actually tortured himself, published a book called La Question. It blew the lid off the horrors and sold an incredible 60,000 copies in just one day. The French state scrambled to suppress it, censoring over 250 books, newspapers, and films. But the evidence just kept piling up. A highly confidential 1960 Red Cross report officially confirming the horrific treatment of detainees even got leaked to the press. These courageous voices made sure that the international community and the opposition back in France couldn't ignore the stark reality anymore. Okay, part 4, the Evian Accords and the incredibly heavy toll of independence. Under mounting international pressure and a highly mobilized Algerian populace, the political tide finally started to turn, unfolding in a few key steps. First, in 1959, French President Charles de Gaulle finally recognized the right of the Algerian people to self-determination. Fast forward to March 1962, and the Evian Accords are officially signed in Switzerland, putting a ceasefire in place. This all culminated a few months later in July 1962, when an overwhelming 99.7% of the Algerian voting public voted yes for independence. After 132 years, the people had decisively claimed their freedom. Now, I want you to look closely at these numbers because the historical estimates reveal a massive, tragic disparity. Look at the total death toll. The Algerian reality reflects 1 to 1.5 million dead, while the official French estimate sat at a much lower 350,000. Beyond that, 2 million Algerians became displaced refugees. At the same time, you had 900,000 European expats fleeing the country to return to France. And tragically, those Harkis we mentioned earlier, between 150,000 and 250,000 of them were slaughtered in post-war casualties. The human tragedy across the board for everyone involved was absolutely monumental. Finally, Part 5, Amnesties, Confessions, and the Lingering Shadows of the War. So the fighting officially stops, but the battle over truth and accountability, that was really just getting started. In the years following the war, specifically 1962 and 1968, France passed sweeping amnesty laws that gave blanket immunity to the French military. This effectively placed a heavy legal seal over everything that had happened, erasing official accountability for the systemic torture and extrajudicial killings. It became legally impossible to incriminate soldiers for war crimes committed in Algeria, enforcing decades of historical silence. Concerning the use of torture, it was tolerated, if not recommended. Fast forward literally decades to the year 2001, and we get this chilling admission from a top French general, Paul Auceresses. That statement completely shattered the long-standing narrative. It was the definitive proof that these extreme tactics weren't just the rogue actions of a few isolated soldiers. No, this was state-sanctioned policy, fully known and tolerated at the highest levels of the military command. As we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a truly haunting question derived directly from the Algerian struggle. Can successful military tactics lead to lasting peace without a successful political strategy? Sure, the French military may have temporarily crushed the urban insurgency during the Battle of Algiers, but their brutal methods lost them absolutely all domestic and international support, eventually forcing their total withdrawal. It's a reality that challenges us to carefully consider the true long-term costs of asymmetrical warfare, torture, and political suppression. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.